last thing before we go tonight is a look back at the great American life of Richard N. Goodwin, who died last night at the age of 86. Dick Goodwin gave the Great Society its name. He was the originator of some of its core programs, and then he gave Lyndon Johnson the words that he used to convince us we could all be better. Goodwin is on the left in this photo, then Jack Valenti, then President Johnson, then Joe Califano. He alone survives among the four. And today he told the Washington Post Dick Goodwin was the greatest public policy speechwriter in our history. Born in Brookline, Mass., he graduated first in his class from Tufts, completed Harvard Law, clerked for Supreme Court Justice Frankfurter, and that was before he was noticed by the Kennedys. JFK hired him as a 29-year-old White House aide. After the assassination, Johnson kept him on as one of the smart young aides he used to call the Harvards. That's when Dick Goodwin went to work. And when the current president talks about accomplishments, remember what the Great Society delivered. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the War on Poverty, Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid, public broadcasting, highway safety, the Clean Air Act, and it goes on from there. And so did Dick Goodwin. He broke with Johnson over the Vietnam War. He worked for Gene McCarthy, for Ed Muskie, and then Bobby Kennedy. Dick Goodwin was there in Los Angeles the night Bobby was assassinated. It's not an overstatement, merely a statement of fact, to say that Dick Goodwin, unreconstructed Massachusetts liberal, working not under his own name, but for he served, affected your life today in ways you perhaps weren't aware of. He changed his country and improved life for his fellow citizens. The presidents he worked for got the votes. Dick Goodwin came up with the words and ideas. That's not counting what may be his foremost achievement. 42 years ago, Dick Goodwin had the good sense to marry a young writer and future historian and Pulitzer Prize winner named Doris Kearns. And tonight our thoughts are with our friend Doris Kearns Goodwin and the entire Goodwin family. It is their loss that we mourn tonight while, as we said, all Americans lost a little something with the death of Dick Goodwin.
Oh my God, Brian, I hope you know what that meant to us. I mean, I can't believe you wrote that in that day.
It's somewhat intimidating. It's very intimidating to be at a writer's conference knowing your name does not appear on the cover of a single book. While I wrote for 41 years, all of it, by nature of the beast, disappeared the minute it was spoken on television. There is no permanence to it. But on rare occasion, you allow yourself to be slightly proud of a piece of deadline journalism written from memory because of your love of the subject and your love of the subject's wife. And while it was a sad day, I'm sitting there writing that in the newsroom, hoping you'd like it and hoping you thought it would sum him up.
If only he were here to hear it now. That would be the only better thing of all. Can you imagine? He'd say, yay!
We have known each other for over 3 decades. In my admiration of Doris Kearns Goodwin, I yield to no one. I hope and trust most of you have read An Unfinished Love Story. It is... It's a romance novel that teaches you the history of the 60s along the way, as far as I'm concerned. And Doris, we'll start this way. Every time my wife and I fill a box with something, that means it's en route to the basement or the attic. And we say some version of the following: are the kids really, they're not going to want to go through it. They're not going to know the value of that book, for example. And you had the luxury of going through the scraps of a life, of your husband in life. When did it occur to you that you were compelled to write? And how did it affect his late in life view of his enormous accomplishments?
It really had a huge impact on Dick, which I think is the thing that mattered the most to me. I had seen every little parts of these 300 boxes that he saved. They slept everywhere with us, from one house to another, from one basement to an attic to a barn. And he was so stubborn at not wanting to open them for all those years, in part because he felt so sad about what had happened in the 60s. If he had only thought this way, our lives might have been different, because he carried with him, because of the war in Vietnam, because of his break with LBJ, even though his great work had been with LBJ, because of the fact that he was with Bobby when he died, and he had such plans for the two of them together to do great things for America, that he just didn't want to go backward. He kept wanting to say, I just want to go forward. Until finally, as some of you who have read it know, finally one day when he turns 80, he comes down the steps singing. I say, what's going on? He's singing from Oklahoma. He said, well, I've finally decided that it's time to open the boxes. It's now or never. And then he goes into Elvis. This is what the kind of way he was when he'd come down the stairs. And I was so happy to know that, because I knew that I had a feeling it would help him, because he was carrying this sadness with him for all those years, and an anger that was almost poisoning him to think about the 60s in a negative way. So we made a pact that we would go through the boxes chronologically, so that when we went to the early days of Kennedy, we would forget that he was going to die in 63. That's the way you have to tell history as it happens. We would go through the boxes on the Great Society without remembering that the war in Vietnam would cut the Great Society in two. We'd go through Bobby's in the same way. And then we made this pact that we were going to start with a clean slate, not with our feelings now. And then we just burst out laughing as we shook hands, as if we were making some great pact. But what mattered so much, really, as we relived the decade together, I had developed a certain kind of, not in anger, I wouldn't say, but I was always arguing about Johnson got those bills through. Kennedy couldn't have gotten them through. So I'm the defender of Johnson. He's always the defender of Kennedy. And I could see when we went through the boxes what Kennedy had done. And more importantly, when he relived the boxes of what LBJ had done, he began to soften. He remembered those great, great days. And what mattered even more than that, in the last year of his life when he got cancer, he was so happy with doing what we were doing together. It gave him a sense of purpose, that he woke up every morning and he fought everything. He had an operation to be sure that he could get the cancer. It seemed to work. He had radiation and went through all of the strain of that because he wanted to keep working. And it was hard, and it seemed to work. And then it came back again. And then finally he had immunotherapy, and they told us that that was it if it didn't work in 2 weeks. But even then, we went to the doctor, and he asked the doctor for the first time, how much time do I have left? And the doctor said, well, probably weeks, not months. And then I thought, to be honest, when we went home that night, we'd finally have to forget this talisman thing we had, that we were going to keep living as long as we had more boxes to go through. And we still had hundreds to go through, because he had everything post-presidency, too. But I thought, we're going to have to talk about it. And then he turned to me and said, well, the doctor said I have months, not weeks, so we can finish the book. And so somehow that allowed us to keep going until the last day of his life, when he saw his doctor, and he said, well, I think I still have time to work on this. So we worked on this together for all this time, and it was only after he died that I had to decide, could I finish it? And it hadn't really been written a lot. We'd just been talking through it a lot. And for about a year and a half, I just couldn't do it. It was too sad to think about doing it without him. And also, I had to move from my big house in Concord to a condominium in Boston, and I had to figure out what to do about my 10,000 books. And they finally went to the Concord Public Library, 7,500 of them, in a room that's called the Goodwin Room, where there's Alcott and Thoreau and Emerson. It's so incredible to happen. And I finally realized I had made him a promise, and I was going to try. So I started right from the beginning of really when I met him. And then it went on, and I knew it was going to take time, and I knew it took 5 years, not the 10 and 20 years that my other books have taken, and I'm so glad I've done it. It's made so much difference for me to be able to go on, talk to people. He's alive still. We're talking about him today. So my fear that I'd be sad about him dying was replaced by my recognition, and I'd done it all my life, tried to bring past presidents to life. So being able to bring him to life has meant everything.
And I was going to say, when you marry Doris, you do so with the understanding that other men live in the house, men with names like Teddy and Abe and Franklin and Lyndon, who she has always referred to as her guys. They are indeed her guys. Show me a better portrait of the interior of the White House during the Second World War than No Ordinary Time. I'll buy you dinner if you can find a finer book. So there you are with your guys, your career. What's it like to write about your number one guy?
Yeah, it was really a different experience, obviously, because when I'm with my other guys, and I don't mean to be disrespectful by calling them my guys, it's just that I really did live with them for so long.
Told you.
It took me, I woke up with them in the morning, I thought about them when I went to bed at night, so they became part of our household. And the only problem was that I would talk to them often, but they didn't answer me. That would be the difference, right? I remember one time when my kids were little, and I was writing the book about Franklin and Eleanor, and I'm in my study, and I'm talking to Franklin, and I'm saying, you've got to be kind to her. She gets sensitive at times, and she loves you, and you need her. And then I'm saying to Eleanor, just forget that affair you had so many years ago. You're partners. This is much more important. The kids come in, and what's going on in here? But now I have my husband, and I can talk to him. It also means that he can talk back to me, and he can criticize. No, you don't understand what I was doing then. You don't get it. So it was very different. He's sitting right across the room from me. And it was a great experience. I think it really was probably, of all the books that I've written, emotionally it mattered more than any of them.
When you met, if memory serves, he was 40, you were 29. You always expressed regret that you didn't know him as a young man, because he was, knowing Dick, meeting Dick was like uncorking your first bottle of champagne. This allowed you, in a way, to get a further glimpse of Richard Goodwin, the young man.
Exactly. I used to always say to him, just tell me when you were like when you were young. Would I have fallen in love with you? And he said, how can I remember what I was like? I was too busy being him to actually talk about him. But then I found these 50 letters that he had written to his best friend, George Cuomo, who went to Tufts with him. And George had given them back to us before he died. And they're wonderful letters. I mean, they were reflective, they were funny, they cared about the world, they cared about their friendship, and I felt like I was coming to know him. And I think two really important things happened with reading the letters. One was personal, which is that I saw the young man who was cheerful every day. I mean, he said, I wake up every morning with a smile on my face. And when he went into the Army, which he had done, he was writing his parents about a dinner that he had had with a bunch of Swiss girls and his Army buddies. And it was the most extraordinary dinner they'd ever have. And they had a wine decanter that went upside down, and the food was great, and everything. He said, it's so wonderful. I was crying that night at dinner. And I saw this person who was happier than the person that I had known. And he was always vital. He always had an extraordinary sense of energy, but there was this sadness that he carried with him. And I went down and I said to him, I would have fallen in love with this guy. I love this guy. He said, well, I'm so glad you love him so much. I rather envy him. And I said, what do you mean? It is you. And he said, no, it's not me. And it's not just because I've gotten older that I lost something along the way. And that was a recognition that something had happened with all that trauma of the 60s that had stayed with him the rest of the time, feeling like he'd never reached what he was hoping to reach to really change America even more. So that was what really mattered. I think the other thing that mattered was I just found fun things through those letters, because he was writing to George from Harvard Law School, and he's kind of arrogant when he writes to him. He's now the head of the law review, as you said, Brian, and I can run anywhere. You know, they're running me all around the country to give me a job. Every law firm wants me, and I can choose what I want, or I could choose a fellowship to go to Ireland or to Europe, or I could clerk for a justice, which he eventually did. He said, the burden is the burden of choice. And then right after we went through that letter, I found the picture of his law review class. He's standing at the center holding the baton, and there's only 60 guys and 2 women, and one of the women is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And of course, she couldn't even get an interview for a job. So I go running into her and look at this. You're running around, burden of choice. Of course, it wasn't his fault. But the interesting thing that happened is that I saw another woman there, and I decided I'd like to find out what happened to her. And she was living in California, actually. Went to interview her, Nancy Boxley. She, unlike Ruth, was able to get a job because she was not married. She did not have a child. But as soon as she got pregnant, the firm, Simpson & Thacher, let her go. And so she then eventually recovered her career, and she had the children. And then she came back to her 30th reunion at Harvard, and she said it showed that progress had been made because her teacher was a young woman wearing boots, a short dress, and very pregnant. So progress had been made.
And of course, it's well known among this audience, Sandra Day O'Connor's only law job, her first job was in a strip mall in Arizona. And look at what happened to her and how she changed her country and American jurisprudence. You mentioned Dick writing letters back and forth about the world. I'm reminded JFK's famous inaugural address contained not one domestic issue. It was all about our place in the world. Among the things that knocked me out reading this book was the reminder of how important everything seemed. Right now, it all seems so disposable, and I'm wondering if you can expand on that.
Yeah, you know, I think there was a feeling then, and that's what I was so glad that Dick recovered when we went through the boxes. There really was a feeling that individuals could make a difference, and that they could make a difference not only in America, but in the world. I mean, I think one of my favorite memories from the campaign, what was so great about the campaign, if I could just go backward for a moment, is that it was on the plane that they traveled, John Kennedy, and the small staff he had. It was nothing like the bureaucratic staffs you have today. And he actually had chairs for him and Ted Sorensen that could become beds at night. Kennedy had his own little captain's suite in the back of the plane. The press are in the plane. And they go together everywhere on a private plane that Joe Kennedy was able to get for them, of course. So one of my favorite moments when he describes the campaign is that they go to the University of Michigan in October, and they're just supposed to go there to sleep, and then he's taking a whistle-stop tour of the state the next day. But they get there at 2 a.m., and 10,000 kids have been waiting for him, in the rain, in the cold. And in fact, the girls were not allowed to be out that late. They had a curfew, which the boys didn't have, so they had to keep extending their curfew. Okay, you can stay another hour, you can stay another hour. And then finally he comes in and he says, oh my God, I better say something. And we hadn't prepared it. And Dick and Ted Sorensen had gone off to get something to eat at the 24-hour cafeteria. They were so hungry, so he's on his own. And he starts to go up the steps to go to sleep, and then he turns around. And all he does, he said it's the longest short speech he ever made, was to give a 3-minute question to the kids. Would you be willing, if you're going to become a doctor, to go to Ghana? This is that sense of wanting to care about the world itself. If you're going to be an engineer, would you go into the Foreign Service? I think he said college should mean something more than just giving you an economic advantage over the other kids. It should be giving you a sense of purpose in life. They responded with such enthusiasm, but more importantly, two of the graduate students who were there, who I also was interviewed, they're in their 80s, so I've been spending a lot of time with 80-year-old people. It's been great. They started a petition that 1,000 kids signed saying they'd like to give. He never even mentioned the Peace Corps, by the way. It was just, would you do this? And they signed a petition saying, yes, they'd give 2 years of their life. That petition, word of that, got to Dick and Ted, and they wrote a speech for John Kennedy where they called for a Peace Corps. So that's the Peace Corps being born because the young kids themselves had made it happen. And they wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. And they wanted to be able to feel like we were a beacon of hope for the countries. And I just wish we would have that feeling for young people again, that they could believe that they could make a difference, that they care about America, they care about the world. It made you feel authentically to be alive, as Dick said, when there was that feeling that was spread. How can that be that we get that in some feelings sometimes and it goes away in other times?
Do we have any Peace Corps volunteers in the audience? Just show of hands. No, I'm shocked.
Usually there are.
Yeah. My late brother was in the Fiji Islands for 2 years
really?
and loved his service to the Peace Corps. Tell me about the moment you write about when Dick goes into the employ of John F. Kennedy. I mean, it's a big deal.
Yeah, what happened is that he worked as a clerk for Justice Frankfurter, and then he went to the congressional committee that was investigating the rigged television quiz shows. I'm sure some of you may have seen the movie that Robert Redford did called Quiz Show, which is about my husband played by Rob Morrow, and perfect movie, actually. I mean, at the end of it, I remember Redford said, what did you think when we saw the preview of it? He said, how could I not love it? I'm played by a handsome actor. I'm the moral center of the movie, and I have the last line. The last line of the movie was, I thought we were going to get television, but television's going to get us.
Yeah.
A rather prophetic line.
It was prescient.
But anyway, so what happened is he's one of those bright young things in Washington that probably Kennedy was keeping his eye on. And he decided he was going to be running for president. And so they needed a second speechwriter under Sorensen. So Sorensen called him up and said, would you like to try your hand drafting a speech while he was working for the congressional committee? And he thought he was just helping with a speech. He didn't realize. He tried it, then it asked him another and another. And finally he got the job, and only later found out that they'd asked 30 other people to do the same thing. He would have been panicked, he said, if he had known that, some of whom were published authors. So on he becomes as the young Ted Sorensen's help.
Tell me about his recollections and what pushed him together in life as a friend of Jackie Kennedy?
Yeah, I think the two of them really bonded from early on during the Kennedy administration, because Dick really loved literature and culture and theaters as much as he loved politics. I mean, politics was in his blood, but the other thing was really in his heart in some ways. So it started when Jackie was trying to figure out how to save the Egyptian monuments that were going to be undone by the Aswan Dam project, Abu Simbel among others. And they needed to raise money privately, and they needed to get Congressman Rooney to go for it publicly. And he became her partner in that. And the two of them did it together. They raised a lot of money. And then the Egyptian government gave them a scrapbook to pick a temple that they could bring to America for having done that. So the two of them are going through the scrapbook together of a bunch of different temples, and they picked the Temple of Dendur, which is at the museum in New York. So that solidified a beginning of a friendship. But then he would send her memos of things she might want to do, one of which was to have a Nobel Prize winner dinner, just to show young kids that if you worked hard in something like science, you could be honored at the White House. And they added to it the Pulitzer Prize winners as well. And it turned out to be the night that later has been called the dinner in Camelot. And because he had come up with the idea, he got to escort Jackie to that dinner. So look at the expression on his face.
Look at how smooth he looks. He's such a smoothie.
He looks like he's just won the lottery, to be honest. And they're playing the music, and he goes in, and that's the dinner when they get in that John Kennedy makes the famous quip that this is the most extraordinary collection of talent ever assembled in this room of the White House, except for the night that Thomas Jefferson dined alone.
Yeah.
So that was, but it was a wonderful night. It went on for a long time, and I asked him for more details about it, and then finally he said that they had had so much to drink, and then they went to Schlesinger's house afterwards that he could hardly remember it. So I luckily somebody wrote a book about it, so I was able to give his rendition even more than my husband, who was so happy that he couldn't remember half of it.
And by the way, just to note, the story Doris was telling about Egypt, this was a quaint notion, something we used to call foreign aid. And it's where the United States would give money to foreign interests and make friends around the globe, just to fill in the blanks. Tell me about the role Dick played right after that woman lost her husband.
Yeah, what was so hard about it was that just on the day that John Kennedy died, on November 22nd, Dick was the man in the news because he had just been given a new job in the White House to be a special consultant on the arts, which was going to be working with Jackie, but also working with Jack Kennedy to bring culture and literature and theater to all sorts of places in America, to poor communities, to rural communities. And he was so excited about it. It had leaked to the press. So he was staying home to write his own. John Kennedy, they called him from Texas and said, write your own statement so that we can announce it. And so he didn't even know what had happened. He called in the middle of the afternoon to the White House saying, I've got my statement. And the secretary said, oh, haven't you heard, Mr. Goodwin, the president is dead. He's been shot. So he immediately went to the White House, and he joined a small team there that was trying to prepare the White House for the return of John Kennedy's body, because Jackie had the foresight, even then, of asking for two things from Texas. One, she wanted the East Room, where the body would come back, to look as it did when Lincoln lay there. She wanted it to have an historic meaning, and she wanted an eternal flame. She had seen one in Paris, and she wanted one brought. And Dick was responsible for the eternal flame, but he also helped the people. He had remembered that there was a book by Carl Sandburg in the cabinet room that had talked about Lincoln's room, and they got it, but it didn't have enough details. So they went to the Library of Congress. It was closed at night, and they had lights that turned off where you couldn't turn them on. So they went with flashlights, and they found the Leslie's Illustrated magazine that had the exact looking. So they put black crepe exactly where it had been on the chandeliers. They brought the Lincoln catafalque. And no public people were going to see this. It was simply when Jackie came home, she wanted to know that in the private setting, because it was going to be in the Congress where he'd lay in state, that it had some connection to history. And then the eternal flame, just that chance that a little boy would want a light on at night, that there'd always be a light for him at the gravesite. And Dick called the people in Paris to say, can we get an eternal flame? They said, we can't get it to you. He called the generals, can we get it for you? No, I can't get it there in time. He said, you can blow up the world. This is all in Manchester's book. He writes, he heard the dialogue. You can't get it, you can blow up the world and you can't get an eternal flame. Finally, they had to go and create these luau luau lights that you had in outdoor parties, and they had a propane tank that would go, and then she pressed a torch, and thank God it lit. They weren't even sure it would light. But those were the moments when you saw, I'm not sure that I understood what a role Jackie played in the steadiness when she was in that funeral procession and how she held herself. And she's in her 30s when she's doing this. It's just an extraordinary thing.
Ted Kennedy's office on Capitol Hill, if you were sitting across from him talking to him in the evening, just over his shoulder, a discerning eye could pick up the flickering eternal flame.
No kidding.
On the hillside in Arlington, miles away.
Wow.
And so begins the LBJ era. And Doris, I'm going to ask you to tell these good folks why it is that every time we're together, I intentionally call your husband Dick Goodman.
Oh, God. Yeah. So what happens is, this is one of the things that Bill Moyers said about LBJ was that there were 13 LBJs. There was the extraordinarily generous, compassionate, brilliant LBJ, and there could be the mean-spirited, petty LBJ. And the Goodman thing, that story, will be part of that. What had happened is that Dick started going over to the LBJ White House because we heard a phone call. We listened to it on tape, Dick and I did, from Moyers and Dick and LBJ. And LBJ is saying to Moyers, I need somebody over here who can write my speeches and put sex into them. What he meant by that, I don't know. Put rhythm into them. And I want great Churchillian phrases. And Moyers says, well, the only person I know who can do that is Dick Goodwin, but he's not one of us, meaning that the Kennedys were the Kennedys and the Johnsons were the Johnsons. But Johnson said, well, bring him over, let him try a poverty message. He did that, and he liked it, so he kept him on. And then the next stage, which leads up to the Goodman thing, is that he then works on the Great Society speech. And that happens because the next month or so after Dick was there, Moyers comes to him and says he wants to talk to us about a big speech he wants to make about his program, no longer the Kennedy program. So Dick says, are we meeting in the Oval Office? He says, no, we're going to the White House pool. So they go to the White House pool, and there's Johnson swimming naked in the pool, up and down and up and down. Dick said he looked like a whale swimming up and down. So the two of them are standing in their suits and ties, and he says, well, come on in, guys. So they have no choice but to get naked as well. So now you have 3 naked guys swimming in the pool. And Johnson finally pulls over to the side and says, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to have a speech in a month or so where I'm going to outline what my program is. I'm getting the tax bill through, the civil rights bill's getting through. Those are Kennedy's. I want mine. So he goes through everything he wants. He knows exactly what it all is. Medicare, all the things you mentioned. Yep. And finally, they decide the University of Michigan, he's going to do it exactly where Kennedy did the Peace Corps. And he asked the kids the same kind of questions. Would you be willing to give part of your life to care about racial injustice? Would you be willing to care about people who are crushed by poverty? And it too makes an impact. So Johnson's loving Dick at this point. He's made this speech. Everybody loves it. But then, unfortunately, a reporter mentions that he had written the speech. And then he goes crazy. So he calls in Hugh Sidey, and he says to Hugh Sidey, what are you talking about? And he says, no, he didn't write a word of that speech. He did some research maybe, but he didn't write anything about it. He said, let me show you an organizational chart. And he goes through a chart of all the people on his White House staff, and underneath is a Richard Goodman. He doesn't even get his name right. It was really hurtful for Dick. It was embarrassing, it was humiliating. But then 2 days later, he's back on him, come to the ranch with me, he's back. But those are the things you don't forget, I think, and that was part of it. Even as much as he loved him, I never experienced that kind of humiliation.
Talk about, because there were these 2 specific camps, the JFK camp, the LBJ camp, because you arrived after Dick had left the West Wing, tell the story again of how you met.
I love the way he says you arrived after.
Well,
Yes, of course, I'm sure some of you know that story, but I found out more about it when we were working on the book. I was a graduate student at Harvard, was selected as a White House fellow. I did get to be selected. We had a big dance at the White House. He did dance with me, President Johnson. It wasn't peculiar. There were only 3 women out of the 16 White House fellows. But as he twirled me around the floor, he whispered that he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. But it turned out not to be that simple, because in the months leading up to my selection, like so many young people, I was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement. And a friend of ours and I had written an article for the New Republic against LBJ, against the war. And they hadn't published it. We'd heard nothing. But then suddenly, a couple days after this dance in the White House, the article appeared with the New Republic's title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. So I was certain he would kick me out of the program. But what I discovered when we were working on the book is that actually there was an FBI report that was then made on me. There was a meeting that is carried in the White House diary with Richard Russell, where they're discussing the problem of Doris Kearns. It's so embarrassing. And finally, LBJ...
It's a problem a lot of us have had to deal with for years.
Finally, LBJ decides, oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So then I find, though, the newspaper articles at the time, swinging blonde gets post, critic makes good. And it was so embarrassing at the time. It's one of those things, now it's a great story, but then at the time it was not so much fun. But anyway, I did end up working for him in the White House, and then accompanying him to his ranch later to help him on his memoirs. And I think mainly, I was always trying to figure out why had he chosen me, why had he allowed me to come, even though I had been against him. Partly maybe he thought I was young and I could be persuaded of what he had done and be persuaded about the war. He never did persuade me about the war, but certainly about his domestic accomplishments. I honored them, and I still do to this day. I thought maybe it was because I was a Harvard, and he had this thing about Harvard. His father used to say to him, you know, if you brush up against the grindstone of life, you'll have more polish than any normal person has, you know, just by brushing up against, than any Harvard or Yale has. That's what he said. But I thought also part of it was that I was a young woman, so I was constantly chattering to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had no boyfriends at all. And I constantly was talking about all these people, and everything was working fine until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous, when he took me to the lake nearby called Lake LBJ, and there was wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I have ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. So anyway, it was an extraordinary experience to work on the memoirs, and it really made me into a presidential historian. So
Wow, then thank God for that. And that story brings us to one of the great women powerhouses of the last century, Claudia Alta Taylor, better known as Lady Bird Johnson.
she was amazing. I'm telling you, my life with him would not have been possible without her. She was so happy when I was there because he took up so much time that it was like having a camp counselor, that she could then work on her memoir, she could do what she wanted to do. But mostly what happened is in the fall of 1968, he had asked me to come to work on the memoirs, but he wanted me to come full time. He said I could live in Austin during the week, but then on the weekends, I'd live at the ranch. And I just said, I'd love to come and work on them. I'll come part-time, but I want to go back and start teaching at Harvard. And I think I also knew I wanted some independence from him. He was such a large character that it was really hard to be able to have your own life when you were there. And he said, no, it's all or nothing, it's all or nothing. So by Christmas of '68, he's going to be leaving in a month. He's no longer talking to me. I was out there for that Christmas and New Year's, and Lady Bird saw what was happening. He would come in the room, talk to everybody else as if I weren't there. And I used to go swimming with him every morning, swimming with her, knew him. He loved swimming. I don't know what I was doing in the pool all this time. My hair, how could it's hard as a woman to figure out how I was swimming all this time. Anyway, he was no longer asking me to go swimming. And then I saw her talking to him. And the next thing I knew, he was coming over. He said, hey, let's go to the pool. And it was as if nothing had happened. But more importantly, she must have talked to him about the whole part-time, all-time stuff, because the last day of the presidency, he called me into the Oval Office. We had not resolved this thing. It looked like I wasn't going to come. And he grumbles to me, all right, part-time. So it made all the difference. And then what happened is, he said to me, but I don't want you to get poisoned in your attitude toward me when you go back to Harvard. Try and keep the way you feel. And then he said, as I was leaving, you know, I don't have as much power as I did then. I won't forget what you're doing. And that led to the book on Lyndon Johnson. That led to my becoming a presidential historian. Everything happened from that. But the one thing that came full circle with Lady Bird was that years later, she had a stroke, and she couldn't see anymore, but she was listening to books on tape. And she listened to Team of Rivals. And Linda, her daughter, Lucy, her daughter, called me up, and she said, Mama wants to tell you how much she loved the book. And I could not understand what was going to happen on the other end of the line because I knew she could no longer talk. And she just said to me, wait, Lucy said. And then I heard her clapping and clapping louder and louder. And Lucy said to me, I asked Lucy later, have I got this right, this memory? And she said, she's so dramatic, just like her father. She said, oh yes, she clapped with louder and louder intensity. She wanted you to know that you were part of our family again.
Wow.
So it really meant a lot because she had known what Dick's break had meant, and I just felt it was coming full circle.
It would be malpractice not to ask you to reflect what's going on now through the prism of the 1960s. This is, as I said, as much a history book of the 1960s as it is a love story. And I don't have to tell you what's going on today. Not that it is without its real estate opportunities in Greenland and Panama and Gaza. You've heard of next year in Jerusalem, maybe next year in Greenland. It is drinking, we're all drinking from a fire hose, Doris. And you're one of those people. We're lucky enough to be alive on the planet during a time of great historians. Hell, most of them are here. Help us out. What do you make of what you're seeing?
Well, you know, just looking back at the 1960s, I think, just to go there first, what mattered then and has to matter now is that people felt they were citizens and they could act out what they cared about. Really, the most important change that's ever taken place in our country has not come from the top down, not from the leaders, but rather from people. When Lincoln was called a liberator, he said, don't call me that after the Emancipation Proclamation. It was the anti-slavery movement and the Union soldiers that did it all. The progressive movement was there at the turn of the 20th century before Teddy Roosevelt was able to act on the exploits of the Industrial Revolution. It was there in the settlement houses. It was there in the social gospel of religion. And the 60s was filled with movements. The civil rights movement made every difference in the world. And I think it then churned up other movements, the women's movement, the gay rights movement. So what I think people have to feel right now is that it's in our hands still. I mean, people say, where are the guardrails? The guardrails are the citizens. That's still true today, and we have to believe that. And as you know, and John Meacham and I, all of us always talk as historians, and the optimism gets harder and harder as time goes by. But it is true that we have lived through harder times before. I mean, we talk about democracy being in peril. Democracy was obviously in peril at the Civil War. In fact, Lincoln said that if the South could secede from the Union, just because they had lost the election of 1860, it showed that popular government was an absurdity and democracy would be in peril, and you had to fight that. When FDR came in for the inauguration, somebody said to me, you know, if your program works, it's going to be one of the great programs. You'll be one of the great presidents of all time, but if it fails, you'll be one of the worst. He said, no, I'll be the last American president. That's how tender it was then. Similarly, the early days of World War II, when Germany conquered all of Western Europe, saved Britain, and we were only 18th in military power, moving up to 17th when Holland surrendered. It was a very, very scary time, and democracy and Western civilization was at issue. The people living at that time did not know how it was going to end, like we don't know how this is going to end. It ended with the Civil War ended with the Union restored and emancipation secured. World War II ended with the Allies winning. The Great Depression came to an end with the mobilization forward. We know how it ended. We forget how anxious they were. We are terribly anxious right now, and we're right to be terribly anxious right now. But somehow the citizens have come through before. One of the last things that Dick wrote was a little paragraph in which he said he was no longer searching for leaders. He was searching for what it was that made these oscillations in American history, bad times and good times. Progress is not a one-way street. And in the end, he just said, it's up to the citizens. And he said, just remember, America is not as fragile as we think. And we have to believe that now. We're still strong. We went through so much in the 60s. We lived through those assassinations. But the real current of the 60s was that people, when you think about what the civil rights movement did, the civil rights people put their lives on the line. They marched. They were treated badly. They accepted that they would remain nonviolent. They set a standard for all the other movements in that. We have to do that again, and I believe we will. But we will. We just have to. Cynicism cannot prevail. We cannot lose hope. We just got to believe there's a fight to be had. It's got to be a different kind of fight. It's got to be sophisticated. We have to know what we're doing. But we figured it out before. We're not a different people now. The big change now that I worry about more than anything is social media, alternative narratives, and not having an agreement on facts, so that part of a population is hearing an entirely different tale from what we're hearing. But even that, John Kennedy said, problems created by man can be solved by man. We've created these problems. We can solve these problems if we believe we can solve them. And I think that's why it's so great to have all of us here in these next couple days talking about the country, talking about history, talking about literature, reminding us that we care, we're here. And we've got the strength. I will have to believe that. It's not just that I'm optimistic by temperament. I have to believe that, or I can't go forward as an historian. So I do believe it.
Thank you. I think everybody needed to hear that answer.
Yes.
And I have a final question, which selfishly is a little autobiographical. My wife's here, and when we leave to go anywhere, when she gets in my car, her door barely clears the boxes in our garage from 41 years in TV, 28 of those years at 30 Rock. My life is there next to where my wife reminds me from time to time that it's tight getting into the car. For all the fellow travelers and kindred souls who are smiling, who are part of the box community in the garage, basement, or attic, thank you for nodding. How should we look at those boxes now, given the gift they were to you?
I think the thing that's so important is, suppose the boxes belong to a parent or somebody older and they're just waiting. The sad thing is, if that person goes, then you go through it alone, and it's a sad thing. Instead of being able to talk to them about it, everybody wants their story to be told. So I've been writing about presidents and telling their stories, and they may be on Mount Rushmore, they may be in movies, but the important thing is all of us want to be remembered by the people we love, our friends, our colleagues, our family. And if you can start talking to people before they die and let them tell their story to the grandchildren or to the children, it's a huge gift to give to that person. I saw the gift that it gave to Dick, rather than waiting. And I've often talked, as some of you know over the years, about how important baseball was to me when I was a little girl, and my father taught me how to keep score so that I could listen to the Brooklyn Dodger games and recount the history of that afternoon's game from my father. And so baseball became a huge connection between my father and me. I passed that love of baseball on to my children, and this is how stories get passed on. My father died before any of my kids were born, before I was married, but every time I finally became a Red Sox fan after the Brooklyn Dodgers abandoned us and went to California, and we had season tickets for 35 years, and so many times I'd be at the ballpark with my kids, and I'd be thinking about the players of my youth on the grassy fields below, Roy Campanella, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snider, and Jackie Robinson, and then I'd look over and see my sons there where my father once sat, and I could feel this invisible loyalty and this love that connected my sons to me and to their grandfather, whose face they never had a chance to see, but through all the stories I was able to tell. Stories are what are hardwired in our brains. Stories are what allow us to live on. Stories what allow movies to be made, books to be written. And a lot of time, the stuff for those stories is in letters, it's in scrapbooks, it's in diaries, it's in journals. I don't know what's going to happen 200 years from now when historians are not going to have the same letters and diaries. They'll have emails, they'll have Twitter, but they're not going to have stories in the same way unless we tell them. So, so that looking out at all of you, if you've got these things with you still, and don't let them go away from you. I don't know why they're not in a safe place right now. And you better start writing, sir. If I could get one thing out of you today, I will read your memoir.
Personal attack. I've been nothing but nice.
I'd love to hear your story, but it's a natural thing. Just ending on the fact that when Lincoln was 9 years old and his mother died, she simply said to him, "Abe, I'm going away from you now and I shall never return." So he became obsessed with what happens to us after we die. And he came up with the idea that if he could accomplish something worthy so that his story could be told after he died, that's how he would be remembered. We don't have to be a president. We don't have to be a world leader. We want our story to be told. And to the extent that there's stuff that helps that story to be told, it's important to save it. Don't throw it out, and start talking to people about it. And then you'll be able to pass on to your next generation the people you loved with as much detail as you can possibly have.
You have just ruined the next 6 months of our home life. Jane is disagreeing. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the essential voices in our country, Doris Kearns Goodwin.